Welcome, everybody. This is the second conversation that we're having in this series. This series is a collaboration between the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, which is a new institute at UCL, University College London around the corner, and the British Library. And we are joining forces to rethink public value and public purpose. And as an economist, I can tell you this is actually a radical, revolutionary thing to do, because at best we think about the public and the policymaking process and those organizations in the public sector as fixing things when they go wrong. We have this very complex theoretical apparatus that talks about fixing market failures. And so what this collaboration is trying to do is to say, what if actually what we're doing is collaborating between public and private and third sector and co-creating and co-shaping society, the market, the economy. What does that actually mean at the organizational level? What does that mean for the kind of public spaces that we create? What does it mean for the kind of ambition of public institutions, including how we would, say, evaluate them, whether it's the BBC or the British Library? How do they both talk about what they do? How do they assess it? But also the storytelling around that. And Rainer here is the Institute's deputy director. I'm the director, and he's coming from Estonia, which is a fantastic country to actually think about some of these things, because they're leading on some things, like the digital revolution, which is going to be the subject matter tonight, but also having some problems around, for example, inequality. And so this whole thing of how do you actually nest some ambitions, whether it's digital or the green economy, within also a program to have a more inclusive society and inclusive growth is one of the hard tasks that we're dealing with. And I should say something that I said in the first kickoff meeting a week ago, which is this should be a bit of an uncomfortable discussion. No one should feel very comfortable with the issue and discussions around public value and public purpose, because we actually think they're really not being tackled out there. So it might have to be quite disruptive and kind of debunk some myths and some status quo thinking. Anyway, so I'm going to hand over to Rainer, who will introduce tonight's session. He'll also introduce Mike, who we're extremely happy to have here. And welcome again, and we really hope that you will continue to join us. And please do pick up a poster. I've folded it, so I've made it much less attractive than it was. But there's a poster outside. Feel free to pick one up, hang it in your workplace, or draw on the other side if you have kids. Anyway, thank you. Handing over to Rainer.
Oh yeah, I don't need it. Thank you so much, Mariana, for these introductory words. Yes, my name is Rainer Kattel, and indeed I am from Estonia. That, of course, qualifies me for talking about anything digital, and that's why I'm here today talking with Mike Bracken. And I will just talk about the structure of our discussion. I will do a brief introduction of who we are, who Mike is, who I am, and then I will try to give you sort of the lay of the land, why we're talking about data, and why we're actually not talking about so much data, but much more actually what's around data, the institutional issues around data. And then I will indeed talk a bit about Estonia's experience, because I think it is relevant, because I'm sure even here in this room, most of you think of Estonia as the paradigmatic example of digital revolution, especially in the public sector. And as Mariana was saying, we have to debunk some of the myths, and so I will try to do a bit of that, but that would actually lead into Mike's discussion of more wider, but also UK-specific institutional issues around digital data and all that this entails. And then we will have a bit of Q&A between ourselves. Well, I will ask and Mike will answer. And then we will, of course, open it up for you as well. So we should have a half an hour blocks, roughly. So you should have really enough time at the end of the discussion to ask questions and provoke, or however you want to do it. So, and thanks for coming. So it's nice to see the full room. And so, yeah, a bit about myself. Yeah, I come from Estonia, where about 15 years ago I created an institute on governance, which by now has become one of the leading institutes in Europe on digital transformation in the public sector, or at least we are the institute where I come from, they now lead one of the largest EU-funded projects on governance. And so this is where my background is. I have dealt with digital issues around 15 years, again, because of partially actually being in Estonia, looking at the, in a way, from outsider view of consuming those services and seeing then the hype around it and saying there is some sort of cognitive dissonance, but I will get to that in a bit of time. But I will just also introduce Mike. Mike Bracken is also a visiting professor at IIPP. This is his main job, of course. And he is currently partner at Public Digital, which is essentially a team that created UK's government digital service in 2011, made it an award-winning design and digital solution. And after leaving UK government, Mike created Public Digital. Before that, he worked at the Guardian as well. And Public Digital has just hot off the presses published a book on these topics. So how do you scale digital transformation in public sector, but also in other organizations. So, and please go to Amazon, buy it. I have pre-ordered it, but it's just here. So, so if you look at our topic today, it's just called Unlocking Public Value from the Data Revolution. And I think everybody here in this room, you have been seeing in the news that data is all over. I mean, in that sense, there's Facebook scandal, there's all these discussions going on. So data somehow seems to be so important, and the ownership of the data and the regulation of the data. But in a way, of course, we should actually start by asking whether data actually matters. I mean, is data actually important? And I would say that data is only so very important as it is embedded in a wider discussion of institutional issues around data, because we can almost think of data as Lawrence Lessing used to say about code, that code is law. Code is as important as law because it creates regulations. And I think we should look at data in the same way. It's not about single data points or even databases. It's actually what data does as an institution in terms of how it guides us, how it makes us do certain things. So yes, there has been this, if you look around, the issues around Facebook sharing the data from 80 million people. But again, it's not the data that has been shared, but it's actually that the illegality of it that has been shared, or even the fact that most of the users have no idea that the data has been shared, or as the everyone's research just recently that came out, I think last week, showed that in UK, I think more than 80% of people do not know that if they like something on Facebook or if they share something on Facebook, that this data is actually gathered by somebody. So even if if you're not aware of that, you actually don't know that this data is gathered by somebody. So it's an institutional fact rather than just data in itself. And of course, the Windrush issues. I mean, I think everybody, when reading about destruction of landing cars, was thinking, well, I have a phone in my pocket that actually functions as a scanner. Why didn't they scan it? So it's not about data or ability to use data, but it's actually what do you have in terms of policies, institutions around it. Or if you think a few years back when the European Union had a major refugee crisis, again, one of the key issues was how do you identify people that were coming from the Middle Eastern countries, even if those people had Facebook and Gmail contacts, but you couldn't identify them. So you have all those data issues, but my point is that almost all of these data issues are actually institutional issues, so they're not just purely about data. And I think this is what we want to understand today in this discussion is what are the actually institutional challenges that we face because of the data revolution. So not the data revolution in itself, but actually the institutional challenges and organizational challenges as well in the public sector. And I always like to quote Barack Obama in this instance, and to just read out the quote: "We live into business in the information age, but the last major reorganization of the government happened in the age of black and white TV," end of quote. And I think a lot of people working in the digital arena are feeling the same way, that there is something going on in the world at large, but the government pretty much looks the same, acts the same, and just wants to use data for bits and pieces here and there. And this is where I come to Estonia, because of course Estonia would be a paradigmatic example of what Barack Obama was talking about. Again, I'll just read a few examples from headlines. So this is New Yorker, the magazine from 2017, December. It's a headline: Estonia, the digital republic. Its government is virtual, borderless, blockchained, and secure. Has this tiny post-Soviet nation found the way of the future? Or Financial Times, I quote, "How Estonia set the pace on the way to digital government." Or The Economist, I quote, "Estonia is trying to convert the EU to its digital creed." So there is this out there, this idea that Estonia has been one of the leading nations in doing the digital transformation. And indeed, again, I'm looking at some of the figures. So Estonian government claims that its e-government infrastructure saves 2% of the GDP annually, and the GDP is about 25 billion euros. So 2%, this is almost close to the savings by the GDS achieved. And more than 800 years are saved in working time for public and private sector every calendar year because of the using of the digital infrastructure. So you can sign contracts, for instance, electronically. And there are more than 2,300 public and private services that can be used over the public free digital infrastructure, which is basically based on access through your ID card. And by 2017, the digital signature has been used close to 350 million times in a nation of 1.3 million people. And the digital ID penetration is close to 100%. So you see that there is an infrastructure that is clearly working and that is clearly having an impact. And even the electronic voting, so 30% of the votes in Estonia, both in local and national elections, are done digitally. And most of the prescription medicines are done digitally. Most of the health data is digitally. And of course, there is this famous Skype mafia as well. So you can go on Twitter today, hashtag Skype mafia, and you could follow most of the people actually active around Estonian digital transformation because they see themselves as a Skype mafia. So there is this, or has been for a very long time, this enthusiasm, real success in creating the infrastructure, creating the ID card, services, signature, and all that. There is this real success. But when I started to do more close research like a few years ago, and I did interviews with all of the architects of this digital success, from prime ministers to presidents to businessmen, and almost 8 out of 10 were really skeptical. They were really pessimistic about Estonia's future in terms of digital agenda. They thought we had missed the opportunity here. And I was really surprised because I thought I will get the PR talk also from them. They will try to convince me, who I was always slightly critical of these developments, that no, this is actually really good. There's really something we need to all believe in that. And actually, funny coincidence is that today a new political party was launched in Estonia by one of the IT entrepreneurs. And its first key point they want to change is to reform the e-government of Estonia because they think it's actually not working for the citizen. It's yes, the infrastructure is working, it saves costs, it's very efficient. But the services itself, health, education, actually not that different. And indeed, if you look at data, for instance, if you look at OECD, Citizen Satisfaction Service, Estonia ranks among the lowest in OECD countries in how citizens are satisfied, for instance, with health services and the like. So there is clearly something going on. And of course, there is an important backdrop as well to this. If you, as Mariana was mentioning, Estonia is one of the most unequal societies in Europe. So it has one of the highest Gini indices, for instance. And it has the highest gender pay gap in Europe. It has one of the highest new incidences of HIV and death rates from drug abuse. So there is clearly, this is the backdrop for most people living in Estonia saying, well, yes, we have this e-government that seems to be working really well, saving a lot of money and sort of a lot of time. But actually, our services are not getting better at all. And so this sort of what you can call a cognitive dissonance, I think, is really one of the fundamental issues to understand, not only about Estonia, but also, I think almost in every country that is doing something important in digital agenda, there is similar issues are abounding. And so I think one of the key questions is to understand what went wrong, and I think this is where we get into our discussion today, is that I think most governments think about themselves, and Estonia is not an exception, as a cost. They see themselves as an expenditure they have to somewhat justify. And that's why the IT offers a really nice way to save. So you can easily save with IT. If you do it halfway decently, you can save very easily. But it actually doesn't look at sort of the public value created. And as Mariana is in her new book is arguing, we don't see governments as value creators. And I think this is the really fundamental backdrop that IT and digital revolution in government is missing. We look at digital agenda through the lenses of costs. We mostly understand digital agenda in government through cost. And I think this is where we have paid very little attention, I think, recently, is do we need actually new types of capabilities in governments? or perhaps we even need new institutions in governments, new types of organizations. And I think this is one of the challenges that you can take away from Estonia. Is yes, the infrastructure is there, but actually the capabilities in organizations to transform services themselves have not been developed. And the framework for government to think about itself has not been developed to be proper framework for the digital age. It's actually a framework from where we come from. And so the last point I want to make before I give floor to Mike is really that I think the digital transformation in the public organizations has to be accompanied by similar processes in politics as well. Because if you look at the parties, for instance, they come from 19th century. They are the similar type of organizations. They are actually not really properly domesticated into the digital age, if you will. But the same way about the localities we live. I mean, again, the local government, the services that we see, even the streets, basically, they are not really domesticated to this digital age. And I think this is where we have key challenges, not only in Estonia, but I think in other countries as well. And I think this is the perfect introduction for Mike to take up the question of institutional challenge from the data revolution. So please go ahead.
Thanks, Rainer. Hello, my name's Mike Bracken. I'm from the internet. Thanks for attending tonight, and thanks for your introduction, and the IIPP for asking me to speak, and for the British Library for hosting this event. Tonight I want to make the case for the creation of new internet-era public institutions, and also deal with issues of data, platform economics in the following discussion and Q&A. As a partner at Public Digital, some of my colleagues are here, we work with large organisations, governments, public bodies, large corporates, with the messy business of adapting the internet era to their businesses. I find the sectors barely differ in their approaches and culture. Executives cling to hierarchical management structures, pulling levers often that fail to work. Legacy organisations obsess about running creaking business models and frictional business models, and are bemused when internet-era companies move ahead. Users, customers, citizens, they tire of frictional business models and seek out intermediaries who cut through the noise for them. And engineers, designers, product managers, and those with user-facing digital skills remain buried under corporate structures, poorly suited to rapid delivery or change. The consequences of this are plain to see. Earlier this week, when the CEO of the TSB Bank blamed the organisation's failure to operate on techie issues, we get a view into the chasm between the boardroom and the front line. As my colleague Ben Terrick commented, it is simply no longer acceptable for CEOs to talk in this way. But for a private company like Lloyds TSB this week, sticking with old ways is their choice. It may be one the market rewards with extinction. Public institutions making the same choice don't face the same consequences. When the Home Office's response to the unfolding realities of Brexit is to issue an app which can't be used on an Apple device, or when tens of thousands of women miss cancer screenings due to an IT glitch, we see just how little internet-era experience is present in our government. In the absence of leadership from within, government often seeks guidance from outside. Informed guides are out there. DeepMind Health, less than a mile from here, is one of the UK's leading technology companies. It possesses algorithms capable of improving health outcomes for the nation, yet it is stumbling through a regulatory and oversight environment that is pre-internet. It's time to recognise that our institutional operational model is becoming a problem for those inside and outside the state. Alongside the work of renewing and transforming our existing institutions, it is now time to recognise that we need some new exemplars, public institutions designed for an internet-era society. These exemplars will be open, agile, and have a relentless focus on meeting the rapidly changing needs of users. In Britain, our institutions were created in response to different crises from a different time. They are often still run on Victorian models or show their links to the Industrial Revolution. This manifests in strange ways. Take architecture. Much of Whitehall, rebuilt around 1910, pointed back to 18th century France, rather than to adopt the then new wave of modernism. That wasn't an accident. Classicism as a cultural norm in the age of the modern is a peculiar and very conservative institutional trait. I should, courtesy insist, point out at this point the British Library deserves praise for not following this trend. The absence of Palladian structures and lavish gilded interiors is admirable, although I didn't see the bar when I walked in. How this building adapts to the operating model of, say, Wikipedia is less clear. There are four major reasons why I believe that pre-internet era institutions need some new exemplars in order to improve public value. First, our institutions are becoming more distant and irrelevant as they fail to act. Many British institutions have proud legacies and achievements, but too many are resting on those laurels. Take the BBC, which has been under sustained attack in recent years. Much of the invective it receives is unfair, but it has exposed itself. Back in 2006, one of the best internet-era people I know, Tom Coates, wrote a fascinating blog post entitled, "Is the Pace of Change Really Such a Shock?" In this piece, Tom argued eloquently that the BBC simply hasn't watched the inexorable rise of new technologies around it and failed to adapt. He said executive claims that new technology is moving at breathtaking speed were certifiable bullshit, which is true. The technology environment in which the BBC operates has been slowly changing for decades. Tom likens this pace of change to being eaten by a giant snail, which moves slowly but eats everything in its path. Watching British institutions largely fail to adapt to changing trends, such as broadband adoption and streaming services like Netflix, is a good example. Sadly, Tom's generation of internet-era technologists who once inhabited and led the BBC now largely work elsewhere. The second reason is institutions which fail to react then create the need or desire for intermediaries to involve. In emerging countries, public digital sees intermediaries regularly. In Peru recently, we encountered Senor Alejandro sitting opposite a government building in Trujillo. As successive governments fail to transform public services for the internet, citizens often arrive at the government building with the wrong information or letters to present. It's a profound social problem. People travel for a long time to get to this building. Yet for just 5 soles, Senor Alejandro, armed with a laptop, a printer and a large umbrella because it's very hot, will happily create a new document so that the user can re-enter the government building and complete a transaction. Who knows how accurate or verifiable the data is, but Senor Alejandro is more trusted by users than the Ministry of Government, despite putting unverifiable data into the government machine on a daily basis. We may feel that basic examples like this may not happen here, yet I would contest that recent financial issues at Capita and Carillion are simply this intermediary issue writ large. When we trust or have to rely on intermediaries more than the institutions they contract from, we reduce the stock of public value in society. Third is the issue of hidden users and their needs. All organisations claim to know their users. Few actually do. Largely that is because they are in broadcast mode, sending out messages to a wide audience, not knowing where it lands. In the internet era, the consequences of the actions of our institutions on previously unseen groups in society is easier to see. In the coalition era, the Register to Vote programme, a simple web service optimised for mobile, helped 3 million new people enter the voting register. There is no evidence that this simple service affected the outcome of the 2017 election. And yet the previous voting service and the operations of the institutions who run it were perceived to have been universal in reach. Whilst I believe that's a positive outcome, other institutions can now see the negative reality of failing to meet their promise. Ken Loach's film, I, Daniel Blake, has shown the world the effect of failed institutional models, in this case DWP's first iteration of universal credit. In an internet era, hidden users and their realities become common knowledge very quickly. The fourth reason, and lastly and appropriately, is the issue of politics. Software is politics now. Being fit to govern means having a deep understanding of the internet and of the software cultures, trends and opportunities therein. When Tim Cook and Mark Zuckerberg call for regulation, as they did recently, one has to ask who is fit to govern. Our institutions are in no state to create thoughtful internet-era regulation and policies. Instead, cabinet ministers publicly babble about looking for the necessary hashtags, complaining that the giant snail has been eating politics since before the web existed, and it's now moving too quickly for our politics to cope. Meanwhile, in Canada, its political leader talks eloquently about quantum computing. Another obvious break on our institutional reform is the seriously out-of-date accountability mechanisms outside Whitehall. Our regulators, parliamentary committees, the NAO, the ITO, Monitor, none of these are equipped to deal with this, and none are bringing in people who can. The giant snail is eating our ability to regulate and enforce the changes that society increasingly demands. These four issues, relevance, lack of reaction, exposed groups of hidden user needs, and regulatory and political failure, mean it's time to start again and design some new public institutions. In this race for new institutions, and we are in a global race here, as Rainer gave evidence of Estonia, we start with some advantages. Over the last decade, a number of our public institutions have developed good practices worthy of note. In Swansea, the DVLA has brought its crumbling IT in-house and transformed digital motoring services. The National Archives, Companies House, continue to show great initiative. CityMapper resulted from TfL's open data push. Innovation is not and never has been an exclusively private sector habit. All is not lost. One factor which all public organisations who have enjoyed success in the internet era share is that they have great teams and internet era leadership. The top of our civil service, always keen to compare itself with other countries on measures it is comfortable with, support the complacent view that we are ahead of the pack. But I have seen time and again that while more immature democratic institutions have their own challenges, they are capable of moving far faster thanks to the lack of inertia and pre-internet power structures. We may be ahead now, but we're not favourites to win. I'd like to finish with some practical next steps we could take to begin to unlock public value in an internet era. The first is to create several exemplar internet era institutions, set up to solve some of the emergent problems we face. Allowing them to redesign and readdress some mainstream approaches in healthcare, adult social care, identity, education and welfare would be a good start. Then we should not burden them with false certainty about the specific outcomes and certainly not push them towards lab-style approaches which push change to the periphery and uphold the status quo. Instead, our new public institutions must be run by internet-era natives and design out hierarchical, chest-beating leadership models. Our institutions need leaders who understand the digital world rather than cover it with consultant papers and describe profound change in society as internet jibber-jabber, as one did recently. They will need a new economic model to assist them, one which values people and skills more than big capital investment, and where the value of the outcomes they create is clearly identifiable in an ongoing funding agreement. Rather, this is too often the case where big IT investment is used to justify years of failing service provision and reduce public value. Finally, these institutions should be the natural home of our internet-era technologists, engineers, service designers, product owners, user researchers, and so on. As Brunel and Bazalgette did in the UK in different eras, bringing together a wide cast of characters who have a mastery of new technology and the ability to reimagine public value will provide exponentially more of that value. Far better than that, than wasting those talents on propping up our existing institutional models and leadership. The giant snail is coming, whether we like it or not. We need to move fast and make things. Thank you.
Thank you for this. Yeah, many thanks. And I would first ask a few questions, and then we're going to open the discussion to the wider audience as well. I think the first question I would like to ask you is about the people, because a lot of things to talk about is around people, actually. So the idea being that the people now in government or in civil servants are not, or do not have the right skill sets. So they're not ICT background engineers or designers. How important is that issue? And if you think about that in terms of other institutional issues, actually, whether the government organizations are too centralized, too decentralized, or something like that. So that seems to me the first question.
Well, firstly, I think you have to widen that. Firstly, this is not a civil service issue or a government issue, it's an institutional issue. And I think, to be really clear, I don't think one needs a background in technology or IT or engineering in order to lead a public institution. Heaven forbid if that was the only people who did. However, I think the long-term culture of seeing profound changes in society as IT problems or marketing problems and putting them in the IT box, as the chief executive of TSB appeared to do this week, that's the problem. And you need leaders who are at ease with having conversations and leadership styles that understand the art of the possible, that digital service creation, technology, the culture around the internet can bring to their organizations. I think it's fascinating that we're talking about the internet as a new thing, but the web was 25 years old last week, and I ran around City University in London installing Mosaic for the first time. Oh, it's got a browser, 25 years ago, and I was like, great, it's new, and people are still talking about when will we adapt to it. And the problem is that we've now got a cadre of leaders. I don't just mean in government. I want to talk about wider public institutions who actually are still not comfortable with that. What that means. They're not comfortable with the culture of sharing and openness behind that, with the understanding that actually things can iterate and change and develop, but you need multidisciplinary teams to do it. And that's not going away. 25 years later, it's just not going away. And those same people go, we've done all the things we always used to do, and look, these new internet companies have gone and stolen our lunch. It's like, well, maybe it's because you're doing the things you used to do. So it's as much about an openness and a curiosity to the art of the possible. You do need certainly a more open and a knowledgeable approach to technology, but it's more about accepting that sort of that culture, that cultural change in an organisation.
No, I think that's a very good point to make, and I think a lot of people, especially around digital transformation agenda, very often see this as a technology issue, and especially in the government. So we need to procure a new solution, basically.
That's right, yeah.
Is that the answer to everything? Is basically let's procure a new solution. And the second answer is let's create an iLab or innovation lab.
That's right.
And get the sort of the guys in jeans or in shorts in and do something.
Yeah.
But I think, and that's what I was trying to get at also with an Estonian example, and saying that perhaps if lives around us are not actually yet transformed digitally. So we go to big shopping malls, we vote big parties. These are not transformed yet by this sort of network or idea of networks, and I think there is something that's sort of holding us back almost.
Yeah, I mean, it is that dissonance. So you've got, I mean, it's just comic, really, the current position we find ourselves in. So take Amazon. You have Amazon just changing the world. The business world is, reeling from the changes Amazon are bringing. And every year, Jeff Bezos writes an interesting letter and says, look at all these ways that we work. And he writes an open letter. He talks about multidisciplinary teams and pizza box and all the things. And at the same time, we have people in our institutions sort of, as if that's not even happening, talking about let's procure an IT solution. And you're like going, well, can we just not see those two things actually are happening at the same time? And you're entirely right. So, the problem when people say, well, let's put it in the technology box, what they're really saying is, let's put it in a box that I know very little about, but I can actually use one or two phrases or approaches that I'm comfortable with to sustain how things are doing now. Meanwhile, over here, the entire retail, banking, finance world and everything else is being changed at the speed of light, comparatively to that thing which isn't changing. So I think that it's that cultural and openness approach. I think to try and be fair to individuals, the thing that's striking in public institutions, particularly in this country, is the lack of curiosity about that dissonance, about how you can have these two things going on.
I think it's a very good point, because the curiosity is something that is almost, it's both a personal trait, but it's also really a cultural issue as well, especially in the public service. And I would like to come closer to the public value issues in a way, I think, because one of the things that always strikes me about when you talk about GDS or people write about GDS, also the people in the audience here, this very strong focus on users and understanding the user and user need. I always have this question about the user and the citizen, because the citizen is something political. Citizen goes and votes. It has views on certain issues, and it's a political animal in that sense, in a good sense. But a user is not necessarily that. So how do you see the relationship between that? Because essentially the citizen should be involved in the public value definition somehow, that we try to change through digital tools in health or others. So how do you see that relationship actually working?
Well, the first thing to explain is why we picked the word user. And we picked the word user because pretty much every other word that government uses to describe the people who use its services is pejorative. So, the sort of immigrant or benefits grounder or whatever. So we had to, and citizen, as you say, is loaded. It has certain meanings which don't apply to most of the services. So user was the most widely used neutral word we could use. We're not unaware that actually there's lots of different users of government in these words. I think that's right. Unlocking the public value, of that is really locked in how we approach and how government can approach what it wants to achieve in terms of public value. Now, the first level to achieve is simply to make services better, to give people what might appear to be a marginal personal value for their interaction with the state. So, should I go to a government website and find the information I need more quickly, my day is benefited by sort of 2 or 3 minutes that I've created. In aggregate for the country, that's a huge public value. Great, we all get that. What then happens are the sort of secondary things. Is if you do it properly, if you make those services work properly, you build them properly, and you have things like open APIs and the data is flowing correctly, it means companies and organizations then can use those services to build more and more public value in places that we first didn't see. So for instance, if you can open the API for things like the land registry, that allows third parties like Juno in this country that are doing this to make the entire the entire house buying process digitized and easier. For everyone who's bought a house, it's an absolute nightmare sending paper around the country. So you get that sort of uplift of social value by government doing very, very little, only other than architecting its services in a way that allows people to create public value. So digital public services and digital service creation actually mask a whole, or unleash a whole potential for both market players and the government itself to create more public value, exponentially more public value than government itself can create. To do that, it has to think long and hard about how it creates services, and that's where the technology comes into play. You simply cannot do that. You can't unleash public value using digital services if you procure them. If they're seen as a solution, because if there's a solution, there's a solution to a problem you may have today, and as that problem changes, you're left with the old solution. So the critical thing to unleash public value is to design your systems iteratively and then have a very good eye on who's using them, how they're using it, and that's where you want a digitally enabled policy group to be able to direct that.
Isn't there in this notion of, what you just talked about, the way we then see users and open it up through to companies and, NGOs, whatever. Isn't there sort of implicitly the assumption that there is a vision behind there somewhere as well, in terms of government or public sector actually having the vision of what we want to get out of it, or almost like a vision of public value actually? Because I think, and that's where we currently are sort of stuck, I think. So what I mean is it's not only the culture of being curious and openness, but it's also actually having a longer term vision. What is the public value of a city or of a health service?
Yeah.
And not only seeing it as a cost again.
Well, it is. I mean, that's a politically loaded question. There should be an explicit statement of public value behind much activity that government takes. In my opinion, that there isn't is probably, there isn't much vision going on at the moment at all. We, in the UK, when I was running GDS, frankly, we hid that vision behind an efficiency play. So our job was to make services better and to save money, which we did. But the vision, of course, that lay behind that was to make them more democratic, to improve democratic engagement, to try and rejuvenate communities digitally, to give better services to the most needy people in the country. I mean, that was what we were doing. What you're touching on, I think, in this country and in others, is the vacuum where political positioning needs to be. Because there are very few countries that have positioned their digital government as a key part of that vision. I would just tell you about Estonia, but Estonia was really a reaction to the Russians leaving in the way that they did back in the 90s. There wasn't enough vision behind that. It was actually a necessary reaction to an operational problem, which is to taking the infrastructure with them, right? Okay. So even Estonia, I think, lacks that next step of what's its vision. And I'm of the view, not to say actually what the UK or any other country's vision should be, but what I'm convinced about is that the countries that come up with that vision and execute it first win big. They win big time. Yeah. And actually, there's no guarantee, as I said in my speech, there's no guarantee that the UK is going to win that just because we have this long history of of civic and public institutions.
Or perhaps you can actually argue that the same sort of internet area culture that is about openness and curiosity in networks is actually perhaps incapable of long-term vision. That's what because it festers this kind of change all the time, because we can communicate so easily, we can always come up with new ideas, new solutions, but of a very short-term view of public values. Perhaps it's actually ingrained in that.
Perhaps it may be. Perhaps it's also a view that may enshrine public values around certain communities who interact, and it may reward people who work together more. It may do. As a play devil's advocate to that, I'd also say that the views of public value that Mariana's talked about, particularly the sort of economic views that politicians like to espouse, they often are just remain views because the structures of government mitigate about actually delivering them.
Right, exactly. No, very good. I think we can now open to the audience as well, because we have been chatting long enough. I think. There is right away.
Thanks, Mike. Very interesting. Wanted to ask specifically around data, data philanthropy, data ownership. I thought it was quite interesting after the Facebook debacle that they put their prices up for data. It's very valuable. There's more of it all around. Wonder if you've seen any examples by which people are localizing data, having data as an asset, having data as a community sort of asset, rather than shipping it all off to Silicon Valley or wherever Amazon and Facebook servers are.
Not enough. Sorry, can I ask you to introduce yourself? So everyone could do that before questions. That'd be great.
So my name is Stephen Johnston, and I created a thing called Aging 2.0. It's a network of startups in aging.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Sitting here right now, no, I can't think of great examples of communities that have curated their data well, although the moment I stop answering this question, I will do, obviously.
Barcelona would be one.
Yeah, as a city, Barcelona would do that. That's a good example.
They at least try very much to do that, so to open up and really have it a local and both political as well, which is, I think, really important aspect. The thing I think we can't stress enough, I think the political dimension of all this digital is so important eventually, because otherwise we become perhaps too local and too... Anyway.
In terms of pure data, no, because the model that the platform operators have succeeded in delivering is so global, so expansive, excuse me, that it's very hard to see past it. Blocks out all the light. I think that the future is actually in less data-rich but more community-linked networks. So, in the UK we've got things like Mumsnet and other things of that nature, where the latent data value in those networks, simply because it hasn't been mined into in a way that's extractive of value for its business, actually it's left the data unextracted and therefore unvalued. And we've got to find a way to value and use that data, but without the practices of doing that being extractive. And there aren't enough examples of where that's done at scale. That's the challenge. And I think that for too long has been seen as a sort of techie challenge. Back to your techie issues. It's a profound challenge to public policy, as everyone's now waking up to. So I don't have the answer for it. I wish I did. But what we do need, and I strongly think that this exemplar way of trying to seed and find them is the way forward. You're not going to just bring it in at a sort of national or international level. I think we should be actually finding and helping curate some places where that data model works.
And just to add, I think there might be actually disadvantage in countries that have done this large national digital infrastructures, because then it's very difficult to make it local. And so you're almost stuck in this large national framework, then you have to adapt it, change it, and then leads to the big IT procurements again. And so you're back in this circle that you can't really change. And again, what they can do is actually save or try to save money, and that becomes their main value proposition. And nothing else.
There are emergent services that I'd look at. So in Sao Paulo, they've got the brand name I can't remember. It's actually a 311 service. It's a city service for people who are having sort of non-emergency problems with the city and the state, and they're encouraged to share. The richer the data they share, they're encouraged to get a better response. Now, at this point, they're still rolling it out. It's not clear whether that will be a success, but Sao Paulo is so big as a state, it's bigger than most countries, like 5 times bigger than Estonia or something. Wow. So there are cities that are taking the lead to create these communities, and the rules around this are such as explained to me, is that people are sort of, if they expose the fact that they're in taking part, that they are in somehow breaking another part of so that they're not paying tax or their house is unplanned or something of this nature, they're not penalised for doing that. So the barriers are low to do that. Cities will be the place where these are tested, I think, rather than national level.
Mariana?
Am I allowed?
You've definitely allowed it.
So there's so many things that inspire me about GDS, and I wanted to tease out one of them, but just quickly, I mean, you know, two of the ones that I'm not going to ask you about was the sharing of talent, capacity, capabilities between the iPlayer team and what later became the GDS team. That is really important, I think, to this discussion. The one that you sort of touched on, which was citizens not as clients or customers, but as users and all that implies. But the third, which I wanted to ask you about, just to tell us more about, is that on the one hand, Rainer said, we shouldn't be thinking of costs and these kind of static cost-benefit criteria when we're thinking about producing public value. And yet, GDS actually did achieve this massive cost saving, over $4 billion. And this is really interesting because the point is you are able to achieve those efficiency gains when you're not worrying about it, when you actually are more mission-driven, trying to tackle a problem, trying to solve it, thinking of users. Yeah. But can you just tell us more about that? So how much were you thinking about costs? How much was it just seen as a spillover towards something bigger? Or did you just ignore it?
Oh, God, no. So thank you for that. Context is that GDS was positioned in the centre of government, in Cabinet's office, and we were in a group called the Efficiency and Reform Group under Francis Maude, our minister. And Francis gave every part of government a spending or savings target. So if you're in procurement or shared services, and you had a target. Now, what that meant was that a lot of people had to work very hard to meet those targets in a system that hadn't really geared up for efficiencies and savings for a long time. I think the only time we really sort of disagreed was at the start when I said, I don't want a target and I'm not going to have one. And the reason was in that we wanted to create huge amounts of public value, but the irony is had we put a number on that public value, had we said we'll serve X, then all our incentives would have changed. We'd have then not been focused on the users, been focused on the number. And we've started to do things which get you to a number. Put simply, we'd have had less bad existing public services. You've had a less terrible version of DirectGov, which was slightly less orange. It's just not what people wanted. Now, so the outcome, we saved £4.1 billion over 4 years, which is quite a lot of money. Government supply chain for IT then was about 16 billion. So it's 25% of government spending reduced in one parliament on technology, and that was an outcome, not a target. And that's the first thing. Because we were focused on explicit user value and therefore public value, the money fell out of the other end. And it's sort of one of those crazy phenomena that actually if you focus on the money, it's the last thing you get. The reason why people focus on the money is not because they're stupid or they want to, is because the financial systems that underpin transformation are focused so much on the financial view of the world, which says that the world is pretty much going to be the same as it is this year, as it is next year and the year after. And therefore, if you're going to do anything, I want a 3 to 5 year business plan which tells me in November 2023 exactly what will cost me. And I sat there and go, great, well, I'm now dealing, of course, with the finance department of the future because I have no idea what will happen next year. So the very same people who would demand false certainty would then say to me, oh, by the way, the services I've used, they don't work on my iPad. And I'll go, I know, because when you asked for your false certainty back in the day, iPads weren't invented. So the point is with economic modelling that builds in false certainty is that what it builds in is actually terrible outcomes for users. Because you have to make all your assumptions up front where you know the least, and you have to make a big bet. That's why people are, well, if we've got to make one big financial bet, we'll have one big solution, one big procurement, we'll do it now, and it'll last forever. And of course, by the time the poor users see it, it's not fit for purpose, it costs a fortune. That's why we save so much money. I have yet to meet the organisation, public or private, that doesn't benefit from that approach. And yet, the thing that needs to change, actually, is our financial modelling around moving from CapEx to OpEx. That's the biggest. Anyone involved in the business of transforming anything digitally knows that actually you don't want a big CapEx budget. What you really want is the ability to hire people and skills quickly, put teams together, and giving existing financial modelling that degree of ambiguity is very hard, and that's where leadership comes into play. You have to have a trust in the team, and you have to be able to, rather than set ridiculous long-term goals, you have to be able to look every couple of months and say, how are you going on, and have some course correction.
That's really interesting, especially in terms of how did you then internalize it in the organization as well? How did it work as a measure of success? Because you have such a different approach than any other government organizations.
Well, there's a couple of measures. If you're doing I think one of the most unheralded and important parts of our GDS team was a sort of 8-strong, 10-strong team of spend controls people. People like Seb Talent, who are, PhD from Imperial, absolutely brilliant minds, but their ability to put a number on the changes that we're making almost in real time, that's really helpful, but also their ability to stop things. So one of the biggest things, and this comes back to data and it comes back to public institutions, one of the biggest problems of transformation is that organizations are terrible at stopping things and killing things. So as much as we're in organizations I've worked, whether it's the Co-op recently or in public digital, we work with governments around the world, and we are quite, how we're happy to be associated with some of the new digital services in Peru and Argentina and Australia and elsewhere. We keep telling them, just turn stuff off. Like, really be absolutely relentless on looking for inefficiency and turning stuff off, because it's getting in the way. This talk was originally going to focus on the relatively narrow issue of data in that, and that's it's instructive is that most people say, well, what could we do with data? Well, the first thing you've got to do is sort yourselves out, because I get from most public institutions for years have been layering bad data on bad data practices for decades. And the idea that you're going to just turn that off and suddenly have Facebook-like practices in your organization, you're kidding ourselves.
Any further questions? Yes.
Hello, so I'm Laura and I'm working for a digital consultancy company. So actually I've got 2 questions. So one of them is about partnership between public and private. So you were mentioning, for example, the partnership with Google has a really successful partnership with really great results. So I was wondering if there's any best practice in terms of really implementing digital from a public perspective but taking on from the private, and vice versa from on a negative kind of experience, so kind of things to look out in terms of this relationship. And the second one is more focused on the kind of data issue maybe. So I was wondering, to make anyway the government and public institutions more digital on one hand, and at the same time the fact that the government is the first one anyway now involved, and institutions are involved in regulating all these data issues. Do you see any potential conflict? Do you think there should be the same people or the same skills anyway working on these 2 streams, or how they do relate with each other?
Okay, so on partnerships, not sure about the Google point, but generally on partnerships, the way that public institutions, I think, need to broker and manage their partnerships, and partnerships is one of those funny words, it can mean sort of existing suppliers, it can mean all things, is by standards. Because actually you want to be able to work with anybody and everybody who meets your standards. One of the things that continually surprises me is how public institutions, by the choices they make, so to buy a certain piece of software or to adopt a certain workflow, quite basic operational decisions, actually restrict themselves massively from them working with people in the future, because the API hasn't available, or the data can't flow, or as we found in government many times, the partner or supplier you've signed the contract with actually holds all the intellectual property in the data, and you've actually given it away, so restricting you from working with anyone in future. So setting a partnership strategy via standards is the way to go. Public institutions generally have some form of forcing function in the market and with other institutions, so they should set down standards and say, we're confident of our standards, if you want to work with us, you work to them, and those standards should be open, letting everyone play, and also then drive the best culture and practices around the organisation. In terms of teams and team structures,
in terms of general, how do you think there's any best practices? Because not always these things kind of go well, and even, for example, I don't know if I got it correctly, but when you were talking about Estonia, anyway, having the infrastructure, but not being able actually to deliver the right service, or anyway the one that they were expecting. So I guess something went wrong. So maybe.
Sure. That's a perfect question. I have to tell you a story. This just arrived, so this is my first time I've ever seen this. This is our book. So if you want to, I didn't buy it off Amazon either, because Emma just delivered it, so I have no idea. But that shows you how to build teams that allow you to develop that ability to design your services appropriately for the context and the organisation that you're in. This may not answer your question explicitly, but back to your point about Estonia, I too, Rainer, I've used Estonian public services, and I'm also always sort of slightly puzzled by how pretty sort of terrible the design is. I mean, they're functional, their infrastructure is great, but they're not a thing of beauty, are they?
Yeah, no, yeah, I think that I don't think the Estonian digital services have ever seen a designer, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a very stark contrast to the UK, which is exactly the beginning points were so different. And yeah, true, I think one of the things that Peter's mentioning here, perhaps, about Estonia is Estonia never had, and still doesn't have, a GDS-like agency. No. So it was always relying on almost like self-emerging networks of private sector people, academics, and politicians taking this further. So it was more or less like enthusiasm-driven policy that worked for a while. It created the infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And now when you actually need the teams, and you need the skills, there is no capabilities to build them, actually, because we have never done that. It was just sort of was more or less a group of friends, about 25, 30 people, who pushed the agenda for 15 years, and then they sort of got tired of it, I guess. And there was no sort of institutional infrastructure to take it on. Yeah. That's very true. And
if you talk to Kevin, who's sitting next to you, actually, you probably know, Kevin was on a lead architect in the UK, and one of the things that we did to encourage that people to work with us was publish those ways of working in the open. So people could come and work with us on, you could see the code repository on GitHub, and you could come and work with GDS and wider parts of government, having, literally people could walk in the first day going, I've seen your code, I've seen your design patterns, I know your standards, I know your principles, I can get to work. And it reduces the barrier. It allows people to work together much more quickly.
Just to comment on that, I mean, I think the GDS model has been copied by quite some other countries, actually. I think, especially the model about publishing the way you work. I think, for instance, Italy's new digital agency is doing the same thing. They publish a lot of stuff even in English, actually. So you can follow their Medium blogs, and they do this work because it's a very interesting way for public sector to work in a very open way and in a very open setting. So that's and a lot of other Canada, for instance, and the US.
Emma's here, on our blog post at Public Digital, we have a blog post up today about Peru, right? And it's interesting. So we encourage all the countries we work with to do this, to work in the open. Right. And they all think it's because we want to read their blog post. And they all go, oh, we've published it. What do you think of it? And I was like, right, we have to tell you something. It's not what we think of it. It's just the best way for you to communicate with tens of thousands of your colleagues, all of whom then point to them and go, we didn't know you were doing this. And we go, see what happens when you work in the open? So working in the open is about actually working more efficiently in the organisation that you're in.
I think a lot of government agencies, of course, have a big difficulty with that because they have to follow legal rules, and so everything you write in a blog can be then used against you in a court or by the police, and so there is this predicament you're in. But I think there is I really admire the sort of the blogging done by GDS and other digital teams in the world, because this is a really interesting way of actually, because it's not just blogging, actually. I think like the people in Italy, they have actually hired writers from writing schools to write in better language to our citizens, so they get away from the bureaucraties and from these words like even transition and transformation, but actually what can I actually do better as a citizen? And so that's I think this is really the cultural revolution in a way. It's how do you talk about differently?
I think that is right, and I think another time I like to think that we took one of the biggest legacies that we sort of kill that thing of government talking to itself in only language governments understand. Like, that's just not acceptable. Numerous times we sat with very intelligent, thoughtful policy people who'd written things that only they understood, and yet they're intended to, for me and you. So I just sit there and, like the tax code. If there's any accountants in here, I apologise straight away. But if you actually take time to read the tax code, it's like that. If you understand it, let me know. I mean, it's just utterly impenetrable, and yet actually we all pay tax. We all should have some idea of what the damn thing says. So rewriting that in language, using language that people understand, so make government more personal and more easy to work with, I think was a success. I think where we had I became the chief data officer in the last sort of 18 months, where we had much less time to get that right was with data. So whilst I think the language and the words are now in a better state in the UK, I think the data's still quite shonky.
Finn?
Finn Williams, public practice and another visiting professor at IIPP. So, Mike, you mentioned TfL opening up its data for Citymapper as a good example of supporting innovation. I was quite amazed, but also terrified to see Citymapper's new pop-up bus routes, which use TfL's data to find more intelligent ways, smarter ways, I think they call it, of getting people from A to B. They find the gaps in TfL's existing network. And I wonder what's to stop people like Citymapper doing to London buses what Uber has done to minicabs? What's to stop Citymapper becoming another Senor Alejandro, an intermediary who trumps the institution? And what's the public sector's role? And perhaps it comes back to the point about standards, in ensuring those kind of intermediaries create public value and not just shareholder value.
So you could ask the same about Waze, you could ask the same about all these Uber, all these institutions are using data to create value for the users, but also then to, in aggregate, to recreate the landscape of public policy as it pertains in this case to transport. What should be done about that? Well, firstly, we need a regulatory environment that understands what is happening and that's changing. We don't have that. Our regulatory environment is still too often full of people with clipboards watching the number of cars who went past and things like that. No, I'm not joking. Right, so I'll tell you stories of regulators all day. So the first thing is to understand that the first place that the data revolution, call it that, needs to start to affect is the regulators in our environment. Once we have that data flowing, and we don't flow it now, and we can mandate that quite quickly because these companies have very good platform control, the next thing to do is then to put that in the language of public policy creation, where we say, now what do we want to do about that? What outcomes would we like? Now, the second challenge therein is that if we want to do something in the sort of classic regulatory space or regulation creation space, that means build teams and green papers and white papers and all the rest of it. So I think the first thing we have to do is recognise that we need a much quicker series of small reactions to emergent problems. So for instance, if Citymapper is creating value by linking bus routes that are putting certain buses out of business, if we think, and I have no idea, but if we do think that is a problem of public policy, we should as quickly as possible localise that decision making to make, rather than sort of seeing it as required for a whole new national bill around transport, which will take 2 to 3 years, because the issue will have gone by then. So they're the first two things we should do. After that, it's about opinion. It's about political opinion, about what you do. I'm not going to sit here and espouse what I should do about transport. But until you have those first two things, a regulatory environment and the data across which the data flows, and the ability to course correct and rapidly answer localized problems, I think that all is lost. The problem is actually in the positioning of the answer to your question, because our current institutions, yours is a very good question as usual, what they would say is, right, how do we do that nationally through Parliament on a national level? And the answer is, well, you can do that once, but it'll take you ages, right? The key question is, how do you localise that really quickly? Let me just tell you an anecdote about regulation. Different sector, health. If you talk to the Care Quality Commission today, so think about the same practice you made, think about data flowing across health systems. The Care Quality Commission, which is actually probably the most powerful regulator in the health system, its chairman told me that one of the big problems they have is that they send people into hospital with clipboards who look at machines and go, yeah, that one's beeping, tick, that one's, where's the data for this? Right. Meanwhile, we've got this issue which happened this week about people missing tests and therefore terrible results for tens of thousands of women. I've been out of the country, I don't know how that's developed. The point is that unless we quickly get a grip on that regulatory environment and get data flowing across them so decisions at least can be seen, we have no situational awareness through which to make regulatory decisions. What concerns me at the moment, the irony of this is, it concerns me, is the rush to regulation isn't driven by situational awareness. It's not driven by people who know what's going on, it's driven by people often with an interest who are reacting to certain externalities and outcomes that we see.
There's a question there.
I think my question is quite similar to the last question that was asked, but it takes it from a different perspective, which is how do you distinguish between the consequences of most of these value creation activities in terms of the consumer or the user or the citizen, that's the micro unit, and public value in the aggregate sense? Because we focus quite a lot on public value, but we forget that at the end of the day, when things go wrong, the people that actually suffer are the micro users, the micro entities. How does this new vision of using public digital in the right way capture that group of people, that group?
How do you capture aggregate public value in aggregate and yet focus on the micro outcomes? So I think the phrase we use is situational awareness, literally knowing what's going on at both the micro and the macro level. Public institutions, government's a good example. Most public institutions are designed for one or the other. Either they're in broadcast mode, so they're shoving everything out, they don't care about the micro, or they're in sort of customized, personalized users. I care about you because you're paying me money, or that's my mission, I don't care about everything else. Our public institutions need to be able to do both. So I'll give you an example of what that means. In the UK, one of the public services that we reformed was a benefit up in Preston and Bury called the Carers Allowance. Thank you. So I'm just going to get there. And is anyone on Carers Allowance? Have you used Carers Allowance? Hello, Richard. Carers Allowance is given to, I think, about 600,000 people. It's about 80 quid a week then. And it's for people who are caring for someone. And so in aggregate, we look at that as a policy and go, that's about right, everyone should get it. And we pushed it out through through benefit centres and went, there you go, broadcast mode, there's the answer to your problem. In micro, we then started looking at who's actually using that. And then we started getting the data that governments had never collected before. It literally had just neglected the data. And we started seeing data patterns. One of the patterns we saw was a small but meaningful number who were undertaking the transaction and the digital service between 3 and 5 a.m. at night. That's not right? So we then started doing some user research and went out to see people and we said, obvious question, why are you doing this? You may have guessed the answer, because they say, it's the only time I get respite. It's literally the only time of day I'm not looking after someone and I've got an hour or two to sit down and do this. That's a profound problem at the micro level. So what we were able to do is we got a macro level policy in terms of we need a benefit, and we've got a micro level problem, which is it's just basically not meeting those users. So what we did is we took out several hundred questions from it. It's a long process to qualify for benefits allowance. We simplified it, we made it mobile friendly, you could do it in stages, you could do a bit at a time. And so at the micro level, it became easier to do, easier to qualify. We sorted out lots of people's micro problems, and yet the policy intent, the macro stuff, was still met. And the key to bringing the macro and the micro together is a data flow that goes between them. And public institutions, particularly governments, are lousy at understanding the latent value in that data. They either see the macro, usually at political level, and ignore the micro, because the micro comes into the constituency meeting and moans about a service, and no one ever does anything about it. Is that?
Yes.
I'm actually working in a public sector, which is a City of London corporation. And I think we find the struggle in finding the service provider that is not private one. So it's a good thing for public sector to do the service that the city mapper is now doing. The problem is with whom and how.
Sure. It depends who you ask to do it. The first question I think at that stage is, can you do it yourself? How much of it you can do yourself? What's the makeup of your organisation now? We were very much of the view that the public sector, I can't talk about the City of London, but certainly the parts of the public sector we work in globally have been denuded of these skills, the skills we talk about, engineers, developers, people who can make this stuff for such a long time, that actually the key job is getting them back in relatively small numbers, but actually they can be, and there are some of them in this room, people who understand and can deliver technology around public outcomes can fundamentally change an organisation. Very small number, like a team the size of 4 or 5 people. And often it's better to either hire or rent those people from small companies than it is to procure a product or solution. That's always our recommendation, is that it never hurts to have those people in your organisation, because it'll give you more knowledge about your own services and about the art of the possible. If you can't do that or don't feel that's appropriate, then often it's not the question you're asking, it's who's asking the question. So often an organisation will say, we have a thing that we want to do, or an outcome that we want to meet, or a public policy need, and say, but we gave it to the procurement people to sort that out. And they've gone through a checklist and all that, and you've actually abstracted the problem away from the real answer to the problem. You've given it to a process which isn't in and of itself going to come up with the sort of rich answer that you want. So breaking things up into as small units as possible, having multiple eyes on the problem, getting people from different backgrounds and environments to try and open up and challenge them. These are the ways of working now which are normal, not just in, I think, the UK government. They're normal at Amazon. If you read Jeffrey's letter, they're normal at most internet companies. Is to break them down, put multidisciplinary teams together, and try and attack them in different ways. It's never any harm having lots of, either call them partners or call them suppliers or whatever, but having third parties who you can work with closely to try and help you do that as well.
I think another issue, you touched upon it, which I think is very important, is around feedback, actually, how the public sector organizations gather user feedback, which they basically don't, actually. Typical hospital or school are actually quite poor at trying even to gather the feedback.
Yeah.
And yes, as you said, there's so much data around.
That's right. Well, public institutions don't really care about data. That's one of the things we have to, I gave examples of the BBC and others, but you don't care about the sort of real data. So if you really care about data, you go to where the data is. So take a public service. The real key things about data are not just transaction volumes or cost per transaction. It's like who stopped, like who got halfway through and couldn't complete. Why couldn't they complete? That's the sort of rich knowledge that data will provide you with. When you manage your data by things like surveys, then you're not really looking at data. You're trying to collect opinion at a certain point. The crucial thing that our teams used to say about surveys is it's not what people say they want or say they do, it's what they actually do. And data, a really forensic use of data will actually show you that. So if you go to gov.uk performance, it's been neglected recently, but that actually showed a lot of that data live. It always surprised me how little that was used by people in government. But I think that it is good practice for all public institutions to publish their data as much in real time as possible. Because what you then get is other people who are able to look at it, possibly even see patterns in it that you're not seeing yourself.
Another question?
My name is Oliviero, and I doing a master's at UCL in the Department of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Public Policy. My question is in regards of creating those teams and attracting talent. It's quite clear how Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Google attract talent, but how can public sector organizations attract that talent in the same way and without compromising on the fact that whenever there's too much money given to individuals in the public sector, you get very bad political issues arising from the public that start asking why certain individuals earning so much and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, use money and glamour. That's what attracts people to public sector, We've talked a lot about government tonight and about public institutions, and government's a proxy for that. What we haven't talked enough about tonight is the other side of that fence, which is the technology industry more generally and the trends within that. One of the sadnesses of my professional career is that there are 3 people in this room who I know who are exceptionally talented and have been, like me, public servants for a long time with the skills that you're talking about. And like me, they wanted to work in public service because it's the best thing you can do. And the mission of public services is the things that should and will keep attracting people into public service. And yet what we've done, I think, we've swallowed this pretty much wholesale from Silicon Valley. We've gone, you're into technology, you've got these skills. Well, you're going to want to build a social network for dogs, aren't you? Because that's really what you want to be doing with those skills. You've done like 10 years of computer science and you want to go build some sort of, some I don't know, some app that does something completely useless. Now, there are always some that want to do that for money because we've got to live. But the point is that the mission of public service is so attractive to the generation of people who've grown up with and then developed these skills that literally it's often, as we found at GDS, takes little else than just opening the door. Now, opening the door can be quite hard because it's obviously you can't pay heaps of money. You can't break all the sort of payment conventions of an organisation, but it's actually setting a mission. What attracts people, whether for life or even for a few years, what attracts people, I think, with the skills you're talking about to come to public service is the idea to do something good for themselves and for society. Because that altruistic view isn't, you know, it doesn't get sort of taken out of you when you go and do computer science courses. People still have that. And I think people, but what we've failed to do in our public institutions is make them attractive places that people want to work. Why shouldn't people who are on any sort of career path say, actually I'm going to spend 2, 3, 5, my whole 5 years or more, my whole career maybe, in public services because that's the place I want to deploy my skills. To do that, you have to actually behave a lot differently when you're in a public institution. You have to communicate differently. You have to be open. You have to let people try things. You have to be much less structured about management thinking. One of our biggest problems in government was that we had to promote people into levels that they didn't want to go to. Mm-hmm. 2 of them I'm looking at right now, in order to pay them a bit more money to keep them for a while, because it had to be managers over a certain level. Actually, didn't hire them as managers. The point about this is that to get these people in, and they will come in substantial number, is that you have to do a whole raft of changes when you're inside a public institution, to HR, to procurement, to mission, to communication. And that's hard work when you've never had to do that before. And again, it's a zero-sum game in my opinion. If you do that, you'll win because they'll come in and meet you.
Just commenting, I think, if you go back 100 years ago, this is how management theories were actually like. They were actually for making structures and institutions to realize that people actually want to work for the government or for the public sector. And so how do you create this specific morality or the feeling around that? This was what basically Weberian theory is about. So they assumed that actually people want to work for the government. So the government is not the last resort for many people. And now we have an entirely different understanding of public sector and the public management. Because we think that these are actually somehow people who are out there to do you some harm, right? So they are out there to get your money or be in your way of doing business. And I think that's also, I mean, I think one fundamental reason why we at IIPP are actually looking at doing a master's in public administration, because I mean, this is where you have to get people who actually want to go to government. You have to educate them in a different theories almost, and frameworks and concepts, and not just go back to this idea that public sector is somehow inherently wise.
But to link questions tonight, you know, you've asked a question that was a great question, because it's a global problem, right? Everywhere we go, everywhere, people say to me, we can't get people like that round here. And we do the same trick. I sit down, usually with someone very senior, and go to Meetup and go, like, what is it you can't get? Name some, like, Python developer, where are we? Santiago. You can bet there's a community there already waiting for us. Like, they're always there. But the institution has never opened up. They can't get those people around here. They're always there. Right, so it's not about the communities of practice, it's about the institution and getting them to change. But to link it to your question earlier, you asked a great question about data and in terms of how good exemplars. Well, actually, if I was running, if I was God now, I was a PM or a president, I'd be putting out a public mission saying, come into government and try and fix the data, the many data problems that we have in our communities. Try and fix that now, because we're not just going to policy our way out of that, to make policy a verb. You know, we're going to have to engineer our way out of that as well. And the people that have got the skills to do that are often working in the organisations that are now, if not causing a problem, certainly not helping. And getting some of those into government seems to me a profoundly important thing for all governments to do and all public institutions to do, which is, I gave an example of the BBC from a decade ago, to allow those people of that quality to walk out the door between 2000 and 2005. The people who created BBC News, made it a global brand, created the iPlayer, to let them walk out the door, that's sinful. You know, you've got to work your organisations much harder when you're in public institutions. So we've talked about government, it's not just government, it'll be this place as well, I guess, I don't know.
Do you have any more questions, or are we satisfied? I think that's a very good point to end the discussion.
Yeah,
so thank you very much, Mike, for the discussion.
Public digital /
Buy the book, yeah. It's available on Amazon.